All right, so welcome everyone to the Clean Coalition's latest webinar. And this webinar is going to be covering our TAC campaign, Transmission Access Charges campaign, that started just about 2.5 years ago when it launched. And this presentation, how fixing distorted transmission cost allocation will unleash distributed energy resources and save ratepayers billions, is going to be presented by Doug Karpa. He's the policy director for the Clean Coalition. Just a few things to get out of the way before we begin. The webinar recording and slides will be sent to registered attendees within 2 business days. All webinars are archived on our website, clean-coalition.org, and streamed via the Clean Coalition's YouTube channel. There will be a Q&A session at the end of Doug's presentation, so if you have questions, you can enter them at any time in the control panel for your GoToWebinar app, as you'll see on the screen right now. So just type them in, and we're going to be collecting them, and we'll get to as many as we can. And if we are unable to get to your question, Doug will contact you within the next week or so via email. If you have any technical questions or any other questions about the Clean Coalition and our webinars, you can email me at josh@clean-coalition.org. And this is our presenter for today. This is Doug Karpa. Doug has several years' experience as both a public interest advocate and private practice working for renewable energy clients on utility-scale solar projects. And Doug has a major role in our transmission access charges campaign. He's going to give you an update and a vast overview of what's been going on. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Doug.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Make sure I get this launched properly. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. I want to briefly return to our title again, particularly the notion of unleashing distributed energy resources and saving ratepayers billions. Nobody has ever accused us of having modest goals. So I want to have you sort of adopt a visionary spirit as we take a look at some of these issues. We're going to go ahead and dive right in because we've got rather a fun-filled romp through what is a kind of a technically challenging kind of area, both from an economic analysis standpoint and a policy standpoint, but also a certain level of engineering questions as well. And we're really going to focus a lot on how transmission is charged to the transmission service and the recovery of capital costs and return on equity and so forth. So we're going to talk about why distorted transmission charges and transmission rate design is actually really, really important and increasingly important across the United States. Then I'll back up a little bit to talk about the design, sort of the components of transmission charges in a simplified way in California. And California has, not to steal too much of my own thunder here, but has 2 different formula that are used to calculate transmission charges depending on where you live. And then we're going to have a bit of a contest, a game show, if you will, to decide which one is the best of the 2 that we have in California, and then go into why getting the choice wrong has really serious implications for the energy economy and particular the cost of a clean energy transition, which California is punching full speed ahead. Moving quickly and breaking things, I think, encapsulates some of the spirit there. Not too many things, of course. And then how we fix some of the issues that we face and what the next steps, particularly in California, are. I know a lot of people on this call are not from California, but hopefully the lessons learned and the thinking that is going on here will apply pretty much to transmission rate design throughout the country, where it's pretty consistently opaque and difficult, no matter where you are. So with all that, let's talk about why you should care, how we pay for transmission charges. And the number one the biggest attention-grabbing reason is simply transmission costs are going through the roof. This is data from the EIA looking nationwide at the billions of dollars invested in transmission. It says past decades, actually 2 decades. And you'll notice this is going up pretty steadily. In California, it's been going up north of 9% a year for some time. That CAISO's expectation is that that should decline to around 7% a year. We're taking that as a business as usual approach and asking the question, what can we do to bend that cost curve down and constrain costs? And one of the big answers is, well, use the transmission grid less. We have run a fairly detailed, but still could be more detailed model of how distributed generation in particular can shape the peak transmission loads in California, and then based on that, taking a look at how the rate of transmission expenditures would come down. And we'll get back to this slide and some of the meaning of it later, but there's sort of one, if you don't take away anything else, this is the slide, that if you fix your transmission charges and can really stimulate wholesale in front of the meter distributed generation, there are really big savings to be had on the transmission side, because avoiding transmission spending can be huge. And in the case of certainly California, we're expecting to see actually an increase in the rate of overall load growth, according to the California Energy Commission. And so we need to be able to meet that challenge appropriately. The second part is I want to really draw your attention to the wholesale distributed generation sector. In California, we actually work with solar developers a fair bit. And when we were looking around for people who do wholesale DG, so these are in front of the meter projects, think about sort of covering your local high school parking lot, to take the example of one near me. This sector doesn't really exist in California. I've talked to a number of folks, and they're like, it's just too difficult to do. It doesn't pencil out. Behind the meter, we've got a lot of rooftop solar, and of course, big solar farms. That's actually, when I was talking about utility projects that I have worked on in private practice, that's a picture of one of them in a solar thermal out in the Mojave. So stimulating the wholesale DG sector is actually going to be a pretty important piece of the puzzle when we're looking at our options for dealing with climate change. The third one is I really want to bring your attention to resilience. It's a big topic, throughout the country, certainly in Puerto Rico, here in California. We've had some big fires here. The Thomas Fire made national headlines. 85,000 customers lost power because of a transmission line going out in the fire. And what was more perverse about that is the loss of that transmission line cut the power to the pumps to fight the fire, which made the fire worse, right? So there is, this is not a new notion that in a transmission reliant system, bringing down the whole grid can happen from losing a single link. Now, of course, we design around that for a certain level of resilience. But as we rely more on distributed resources and local balancing and local systems, no single piece is going to be big enough to bring the whole thing down. As I say, we're going to skip over some nuance there. We can have whole other presentations on this notion of grid architecture design. I mentioned in offhand to somebody once the 2003 power outage. This is satellite imagery of the eastern coast of the US before and after. Of course, the after is with all the lights out. A single offline generator and some overgrown trees in Akron, Ohio cuts power to 55 million people. This is sort of demonstrates the high stakes of meeting resilience and why DG is actually something everyone should care about. Now, I want to back up a little bit now that I've got your attention, hopefully, and dive into the nitty-gritty details of what transmission charges are, what the options are for charging for transmission. California has a simpler system than most. But yeah, I think the pieces of the puzzle are often pretty similar. So what are transmission charges? They are essentially the rents in an economic sense, they're paid to transmission owners for owning the transmission grid. So utilities build all this infrastructure, and then of course on the cost of service models get reimbursed for that, plus a return on investment to quote unquote pay for the transmission grid. Bit of an odd system, and again, we should have a webinar on utility business models, whether this makes sense. But that's the concept we've got now. And in California, as in many other places, we have kind of a bifurcation of different components of our overall energy system. There's a high voltage transmission grid, which is managed by the California Independent System Operator, or CAISO, who has been deeply involved in considering some of these issues over the last couple of years and really given some hard thought to this. There is a low voltage transmission grid, which in California is mostly managed by local, our various local utilities, in this case, mostly the three big investor-owned utilities. Again, some nuance there that I'm breezing past. And then lastly, the distribution grids, which are connecting in a kind of radial design everything within a distribution substation area. So those are the three chunks of the grid that we'll be talking about, particularly because they're billed for separately. And sort of as an analogy to that, we're recovering these costs with charges on energy. And it's important to keep in mind there are three buckets or energy sources that get energy to customers. There's, of course, the behind the meter, rooftop solar, homeowners mostly that use their solar to meet their own load. Maybe there's some net energy metering going on. Then, of course, there's the remote generation, which is the big, we're going to say solar farms, wind farms, natural gas, coal, in some cases, way out in the middle of nowhere, which is why the notion of central generation is a bit odd, since it's not really central. And then sitting in the middle is, of course, this wholesale, kind of your local energy provider that provides energy to a neighborhood. Now, the reason why I draw your attention to those is because those three buckets have profoundly different consequences for the impact on the transmission grid specifically. Remote generation, of course, needs hundreds or in some cases thousands of miles of grid of wire to get energy from the generator to the customer. And really, that is why the transmission system was built in the first place. If we had started with distributed generation, we probably never or would have a much smaller transmission grid. Wholesale distributed generation in green, compared to that red arrow that travels all along the wires to get to the house there in the bottom, distributed generation has a pretty short trip distance, involves a lot less infrastructure to get to customers. And then, of course, behind the meter retail just uses your own, building wires. So that I'm going to leave that aside because that is pretty much not used as a basis for recovering transmission in any instance. Now, if these three buckets, of course, the central generation pretty much is always, wherever you're looking is included in recovery of transmission charges. The retail side very frequently, and in California, is not involved in recovering transmission charges. And then there's this wholesale DG bucket in the middle. Some places in California, that energy is charged for transmission use, and in other places in California, it's not. And that is the distinction we're going to be zeroing in on today. And so there are two key measures that could be used for measuring transmission use that serve as a basis for transmission charges. One of which is called transmission energy downflow, which is, if you look at the substation, all the energy that flows down from the high voltage side to the low voltage side. Mostly it's only remote generation. Currently in California it is, that crosses the transmission distribution interface substation. The other place you could measure transmission use is at the customer meter, customer energy downflow. That is, would include charging energy for both the remote and the wholesale DG. Neither of them include the behind the meter. So there are two formulas. I mentioned there are two formulas in use. One, in California, it's the non-participating or the non-transmission owning, mostly municipal utilities, that measure their transmission use and get charged for transmission use at the distribution substation. So at the end of the transmission system, they're getting charged for energy based on the energy that they actually pull off the transmission grid. But if you're in the territory of a utility that owns transmission, then you're charged on all of your energy, whether it's local or remote. So those are the two formulas that are in use. So here, really, the question we're going to drill down on, which of these is better? Which of these gets better outcomes? Which of these meets the standard rate design criteria? So now we're going to go to this sort of what I think of as our game show. Which formula is better? It's the $63,900,000,000 question, because this is how much it would cost ratepayers if you get it wrong. In California, roughly. We'll get into that. And one of the key things that, this is not just sort of something we make up as we go. There are actual legal standards that exist. There are federal standards established by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, certain factors that get looked at. We're going to look at a subset of them that California Independent System Operator has identified and we agree with are critical. So our game show today is called FERC Factor. No, I'm not going to apologize for puns, actually. It's got to keep a little humor when you're looking at stuff this dry. So let's take a look at what those are. Today, we're going to really focus on three. One is the historical cost drivers that gets at why was the existing transmission system built? Who was it built for? And because that gets at why we have these costs. They're embedded. They already exist. So then we're getting the question of how do we allocate who's paying for those appropriately? But that's not the entire question, because of course, particularly say in California, most places you may have, whole new cities that spring up since say the 1990s when a lot of the transmission was built. We may have new data centers or big loads scattered around the state. And if we just stuck with the historical cost drivers, we'd be saying well, you guys weren't around when we built this, so you get it for free. No, that is not how we do it. If you are new load, you still pay for it. Why? Because you're using it today. So the second factor is looking at current beneficiaries and benefits, that if you're using it, you pay for it. Not whether or not you were involved in the historical analysis that led to the resource being built in the first place. FERC affirmatively requires cost of transmission to be allocated to beneficiaries. That's just the legal standard there. The next one is, what are the impacts on the market? How do we incentivize good decision making and foster efficient expansion of the transmission capacity, this is CAISO's language, kind of paraphrasing a FERC standard. So we're going to look at all three of these and ask the question, which one's better? And of course, in this question, we look first at the historical cost drivers. And actually, when we're looking at current beneficiaries as well, one of the first questions is, well, does distributed generation actually reduce the need for transmission? And then, assuming it does, which it does, then the question becomes, which formula or which system actually reflects those savings appropriately? So let's get into, again, we're going to use California as kind of a case study. CAISO, when looking at transmission projects and transmission planning, really hones in on four different drivers. One, of course, is peak load. You need to have a system that's big enough to handle the largest energy flows you're going to have on the system. The second is policy. We have a very robust renewable portfolio standard. That means if you're going to have renewables, you need to have, in this case, a lot of wires going out to the Mojave Desert. Economic resource access. CAISO is in the business of moving energy all around the state and sometimes out of state. The question is going to be, what's the cheapest resource? And sometimes you may have load in Northern California and your cheapest resource is way down in Southern California. You need to be able to have the wires to access that. And the last one is reliability. Again, subject for a topic all on its own, but I'll touch on that as we go. So let's look at all four of these. So first, looking at peak load. This is the load, CAISO load condition. So this is transmission load. really important to distinguish between customer load, which is all of the energy customers use, and then transmission load, which is just that component that flows across the transmission system. Those are going to be different, and in some cases, very different. So we're going to take 2015, and if we're building for a 2015 system, we need to hit this 47,252 megawatt peak. If our system cannot handle that, we are in trouble. So that's what when we're talking about peak transmission load, that's what we're talking about. So let's zero in now on September 10th, 2015. This is the transmission load from the entire state. That's the profile. And I realize those, oh yeah, those are the hours, so 1 through 24. The peak load happened right about 5 p.m. Now, as I mentioned, in California, we got a lot of solar. In 2015, a lot of it's sitting out in the desert. Let's do the thought experiment. What happens if we take that remote generation, chop it into 1 megawatt bits, and then throw it up, say, in Orange County and Los Angeles as wholesale distributed generation? We're taking it off the transmission system, putting it on the distribution system. What happens to the load on the transmission system? Here's your answer. We put up 10,000 megawatts, Southwest, South LA profile, and you hear a lot about, oh, it moves the peak later in the day, which it does, but the key is it also moves it down. And if we're building for peak load, this represents a savings. If we look at we recently, September 1st of last year, got pretty close to our all-time peak load in California. And again, if we were to take the contribution of solar and wind and move it, to the distribution grid, we'd see a 6% decline in peak. Those are real savings. So yes, DG, now these are both kind of extreme, but it gives you a good sense that in principle, DG does reduce peaks. Shouldn't be too surprising. Policy goals. Okay, we need to have renewables, renewable portfolio standard. And some transmission spending has happened, particularly in recent years, accessing renewable energy from around the state. However, it's not necessarily the case that you have to build a transmission wire to get to renewables, because local wholesale distributed generation counts too. So you could take, a whole bunch of 1 megawatt installations, throw them around Orange County, and meet your RPS standard without building transmission. So wholesale distributed generation also meets policy goals. And this slide here, we're going to see this again later. This is really key. Economic resources. We want the cheapest resource. Now, usually when people talk about comparing resources, we look at generation cost. But I think it's not necessarily a surprise, but that's not the only cost. It also you have to get the energy to the customer. So distributed generation often is the most economic resource, even if it doesn't look like it on the face of it. So the red bars, these are the RPS contract price. This is basically utility scale solar, transmission connected. REMAT is a program that we have in California that is specifically addressed 3 megawatts and under for distributed generation. So this is a good real life example of the contract price for distributed generation and for the utility scale renewables. These are just renewables, right? Now, of course, there's some noise around this, but you get a sense that yes, the distributed generation cost comes in a little bit higher, and so you lose those contracts to the central generation. But if you include the cost of delivery, getting the energy from the desert to your city, it's a very different picture, right? So this is adding in the 20-year levelized transmission access charges. If we charge it to both, then of course it's a wash. But if we say, like, look, the transmission energy, you're using the transmission grid, you pay a little bit more, or you pay a lot more for the transmission charges. Now we have a very different picture. This concept of that the full cost of transmission connected remote generation is both generation and the transmission costs you have to incur to get there is critical if we're going to get cost effective energy. If we ignore costs, then they're going to go up. That's a general rule. So transmission is not necessarily accessing the cheapest resources if we have procurement models that misidentify what the cheapest resource is. If we ignore delivery costs, we're going to get the wrong answer. And then there's also, of course, benefits in terms of local and free local capacity that distributed generation can strategically address. And then, of course, there's this reliability question. Often one sees analyses that like, oh, transmission is just a lot cheaper than building generation. It's true as long as your transmission system isn't wiped out by the thing that's causing the problem. Actually, I returned to this Thomas fire because Santa Barbara and Ventura are actually in a load pocket that has a local capacity requirement. If one of the transmission lines were to go down, there would not be enough energy to meet the load there. And that's something, of course, that Southern California Edison and the CPUC and CAISO are very concerned with fixing this situation because of mandatory retirements. Then the question is, how do you assess this reliability need, right? So in this instance, there's a proposal to build another transmission line out there, and question is that the right thing to do? And of course, if you do the traditional analysis, you'd say, okay, we can put in this extra transmission line, $47 million. If we were to put solar and storage out there, it would be, close to $500 million. Okay, transmission's cheaper, right? No, because unless like the electrical workers are going to go out there and maintain this stuff for free, you have O&M costs, you have depreciation, you have return on equity. Those have to be included because ratepayers are going to have to shell out for that, right? So you add that in and you still get, okay, transmission's a little cheaper, actually a lot cheaper, but that's still not the right comparison because, why? Solar produces energy and energy is valuable. So well, this is the same sort of an economic analysis that if we look at, and I plugged in $70 a megawatt hours long run cost of energy. It depends on what that cost is, how the economics come out. But, over the 30-year lifespan, you're generating like $800 million worth of energy. And that has to be subtracted out from the, $847 million that it costs to build the thing. What's left over is the cost of the resilience. And there you suddenly look like, well, wait a minute. The distributed resources actually are delivering resilience at a lower cost than the transmission line. This is the kind of full cost thinking we really need more of as we go forward. And of course, the always question is, if you have Southern California Edison and the independent system operators saying a transmission is a whole lot cheaper when it isn't really, it does lead to the question of, well, who's benefiting from that? Because of course, we're being told that transmission is a better option by the people who own the transmission line. So take a look. Does DG displace transmission? I hope by now I've convinced you. There are, of course, a lot of details that we're not going into, and we could talk about it all day. And some people have heard me talk about this all day, so I will spare you that lovely experience. But let's go with the notion that, yeah, it displaces transmission. Now, how do we design a transmission charge that reflects that? And this is going to walk you through a couple of quick examples. Let us imagine a new world, a different state. We have two load serving entities, one that relies on transmission connected resources for its procurement, mostly maybe because they're cheaper, maybe because that's their policy. Maybe they have no option of building distributed generation. That does happen. And then we have another one that has, say, good economic opportunities for wholesale distributed generation. So they've decided as a matter of policy, they're going to procure WDG. So let's start with, 50 gigawatt hours is their annual use. That grows by 10 gigawatt hours. Of course, our transmission reliant guys, they don't build anything. So their transmission load over the year, the total energy is going to be 60 gigawatt hours. Our folks who do build distributed generation, they put out 20 gigawatt hours. That offsets their entire load growth, and it offsets the load growth of the other LSEs. So the total load hasn't gone up. It's still 100 gigawatt hours. But the total customer energy used is 120. And when it comes time to plan the transmission system, the planners are looking at this and saying, well, 60% of the energy is coming from the transmission reliant LSE customers and 40% from the local energy reliant LSE customers. So that's what we're going to plan for, right? And of course, I'm assuming that peak loads and all the other drivers are proportional to the total amount of energy. This is to help you get the concept rather than being a rigorous analysis of the actual state of play in California. So how should we best reflect the contribution to the planning that has happened historically? There are two formulas, as I mentioned. One is using the transmission energy downflow that the municipal utilities use, and the other is billing based on all the customer energy downflow. So if you're just using the transmission energy, well, then you're looking at the 60 and 40 gigawatts. That's a 60-40 split. That mirrors the inputs to the planning process perfectly, right? Because you're billing based on the exact same inputs that the planning process used. If, on the other hand, you bill at the customer meter, now you're billing based on something other than what was used as the planning inputs. You get a 50-50 split, and the result is the LSE that has gone in for local energy is paying 25% more per kilowatt hour relative to their use paying 25% more than their actual use. And the transmission reliant one is actually getting a subsidy. They are getting a price cut because they are paying, they're responsible for 60% of the transmission build, but they're only getting billed for 50% of it because we've decided to bill based on something other than what were the inputs for the planning. So this gives you a sense of why we talk about, if you do it wrong, you end up penalizing exactly the entities that have historically taken steps to reduce the impacts on transmission, and then therefore keep the cost down for everybody. So it's a good question. Is that the result we want? I'm going to say no. Formula 1, transmission energy, if you're looking at historical cost drivers, is better. And now let's look at current beneficiaries, newcomers who start using existing transmission. FERC's very clear. Cost allocations may fail to account for benefits with new transmission, if you don't look at the use currently. That will result in rates that are not just unreasonable and are unduly discriminatory or preferential. That's a long way of saying illegal. That would be a violation of law and therefore should not be upheld as a valid design. So let's take a look. A couple of years later, had more load growth. Now we're up to 70 gigawatt hours apiece. The local energy guys, they put in enough local energy generation to produce another 10 gigawatt hours. So if you look at how much they are pulling off the transmission system, it's a 70-40 split now. So total is 110. So if you look at the relative transmission use, they both had load growth, but one of them's mitigated their impacts, and saved, having to build for delivering an extra 30 megawatt hours of energy. The actual split is now 64-36% because the guys who were trying to mitigate, they've continued to mitigate, and that's just made the problem worse. We now have Formula 1. If you measure transmission use based on transmission use, you get a good alignment with transmission use. If you measure transmission use based on what's coming across the customer meter, you don't have a good alignment. And so you end up with this cost shift between those load serving entities that are doing something to keep transmission costs down and shoveling money over to subsidize the customers whose load serving entity is not doing that. Again, that would be a problem. So, and there's other services. These, without getting into too much detail, I'll come back to if people want to, but these are other services that get mentioned. They're all proportional to where you're getting your energy from. If you are looking at voltage support services, if you're getting 30% of your energy from local sources, and frankly, local sources are better for voltage support, it's not unfair to say that 30% of your voltage support is coming from those local sources. It's proportional. So if you use less distributed transmission generation, you're also getting less ancillary service from the transmission system. So if we look at beneficiaries, again, Formula 1 wins. The last piece I want to take a look at here of the FERC factors is market distortions. Now, this is a slide we talked about earlier, that if you just look at generation costs, lo and behold, the utility scale looks cheaper. If you add in the delivery costs, it's pretty clear it's more expensive. And let's take a look at how actual procurement works and how this interacts with energy decisions, energy procurement decisions. Under Formula 2, so the right-hand panel here, the transmission costs are actually ignored. They just don't enter into the equation when assessing rival bids because the charges are identical. It doesn't matter which one you choose, even though they have different impacts on future costs. And so the rational thing for the procuring load-serving entity to do is to ignore transmission. And again, if you ignore transmission costs, they're going to go up, right? So that's what we have under Formula 2 for the investor-owned utilities in California. Under Formula 1, the one that's used by the municipal utilities, if you look at, say, the city of Palo Alto, which is where we first came across this issue, if they are looking at local projects to serve local load, now these are, again, in front of the meter, but within Palo Alto territory, they look at generation costs. If they are buying that energy from something that's a long ways away, they look at the generation costs and the transmission costs because they actually have to pay the transmission costs. Ultimately, both entities are doing what's economically rational based on the price signals they're getting. So if you're in a situation where local energy is cheaper, including delivery, then you procure those. If transmission sourced energy is cheaper, which it often will be even if you include transmission costs, then you're going to procure that. And that's going to be true most of the time. Economies of scale are going to outweigh transmission costs sometimes, but not always. And that's a major part of the problem. So I want to walk you through, okay, so you've got these procurement officers sitting there, they're doing their calculations. I'm going to walk you through what it would look like if you actually ran a request for offers, right, an RFO. So let's do a hypothetical 50 megawatt procurement, looking at capacity because it's easier to graph. And you get a bunch of bids. Some of them are from central generators, some of them are from distributed generators. The central generators are shown in the blue bars, there's more of them. The distributed generations are the small green bars. This is about the mix that this is actually more distributed generation than you would see in California, and we're pretty aggressive on this. And so you start on the far left-hand side at 4.5. It's like, yep, we'll buy yours. You go up until you've filled your 50 megawatt bucket. The red dashed line is where you stop. And so you're procuring, you're signing contracts with all those generators who come in at 7 cents a kilowatt hour or lower. Then you still have to pay the 2 cents a kilowatt hour of TAC. That would be the full cost. You end up with 47 megawatts of central generation and 3 megawatts of distributed. Now let's look at Formula 1, or what I call here System 1. Same set of bids, except the central generation, we're going to add that 2 cents a kilowatt hours before considering the bids. So we're going to take those blue bars and we just move them on up by 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Same procurement process. We start on the left-hand side. We move on up. Now our cutoff is 9 cents a kilowatt hour. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's more expensive. Except when you add it all up, how much money are you actually sending out the door? Formula 1 gets you a lower overall price. And that is key. That if you incorporate the cost of transmission on transmission energy, you can end up with a lower price overall. And notice that you get over double the amount of distribution grid sourced energy here. So a TED-based TAC will lead, if price signal gets all the way through to the procuring department, to different outcomes and more cost-effective outcomes. So let's go back. The answer to our question on the FERC factor, is it aligned with historic cost drivers? System 1 is better. You're charging for transmission on the same inputs that are used in the transmission planning process. The current beneficiaries, it aligns better. And if you're looking at economic distortions, you're going to get more cost-effective energy out of System 1 using transmission energy downflow. So Formula 1, of course, I had to mix my pop culture metaphors there, ends up winning on all three factors. Very nice, lovely theoretical exposition. But when rubber meets the road, to stick with the racing metaphor, so what? What are the implications of that? So why does bad rate design cost ratepayers billions of dollars in unnecessary transmission spending? Going to go back to this notion of we've got transmission going up. That's a problem. Or maybe it's a problem. We should at least look at it to see if we can fix it, right? This graph is actually, we're going to scale from the national down to PG&E, where we have a CAISO projecting a 5% real growth rate in TAC. You know, of course, nice smooth curves like this doesn't exist in the real world. So it's a very, very rough projection, but it illustrates the point nicely. Under those projections, we're going to meet 12% of our load with local renewables within 20 years. That averages out for a long-term contract at 3 cents a kilowatt hour levelized. You know, whether this is what we actually see is a matter of longer debate, and we could have a whole other just on webinar on this one slide. So, however, I'm going to point out that if we look historically, we have seen actual transmission projects canceled because of distributed energy resources. In fact, the latest transmission planning process ended up canceling $2.6 billion worth of transmission projects, and they're citing energy efficiency and distributed resources. So this notion that we could save $3 billion a year, maybe not as far off as it looks. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Clean Coalition ran a fairly detailed model. It's an open source model. We would love to get feedback from people if you want to take a look at it and critique it. And we have received some critiques, particularly the fact that it focuses, it pretends that peak load is the only thing that you build for, which of course isn't really the case. But we've got good reason to believe that if we build in the other cost drivers, similar results would come out. And a couple of things. If you were to move everything to this Formula One, to the transmission energy downflow, as we mentioned through the procurement analysis, you would get more DG. We don't entirely know how much more. So we modeled a bunch of different cases, and lo and behold, the more DG you get, the more constrained your growth in TAC is. So if it's increased by 50%, that's the red line, $23 billion. That's not chump change. And I'll point out that $23 billion over 20 years, for those of you who are tracking the regionalization debate that's going on in California right now, that's about the same magnitude as the savings from regionalization. Now, according to CAISO's model. Now, if you say double or triple the rate at which new distributed generation is built, you can get to a complete flattening of the curve, which would essentially relate to all of the new load growth would be met with DG. And the existing transmission connected resources would meet existing load. That's kind of an endpoint, but it would be 3 times as big. And that's also, you know, one of the other points that's critical to mention is, you know, getting this right and getting DG put out results in a lot of local economic benefits as well. This is Hunter's Point is an area of San Francisco that we did an analysis of, taking a look at where you could put 50 megawatts of distributed energy resources and what the impacts would be. That project, you know, 1,270 job years at a time when people are very much concerned with jobs that's staying local and not being sent overseas. That's a pretty important consideration as well in terms of, you know, what's good for society here. So at this point, we know transmission charges are important. We know that the transmission energy downflow is better from a theoretical standpoint. We know that that translates into a bunch of different costs. So then the question is, all right, great, you've identified a problem. Now what do we do about it? And no prizes for guessing that our solution is, well, if Formula One is the better rate design, then let's use that. It already exists. We've been doing it for decades. Let's just do it everywhere instead of having this odd bifurcated system that we have in California today. It's like, you know, it's sort of like using the states as the laboratories of democracy. We are using our different load serving entities as laboratories for transmission access charges, and so we can see which one's better. And I think we've got a pretty good sense. There's more analysis that could be done. That the one that's being used with the non-transmission owning utilities is the better process. What would that look like in practice? Those of you who may have followed this at CAISA, we've been talking about this for getting on a year now, have seen this slide before. You're probably thoroughly sick of it. But basically, the way California does the transmission access charges, we just take the total revenue requirement divided by the total amount of energy, and then it's a postage stamp on all energy, no matter when it's done. Now, of course, we're looking at making a more sophisticated model now with demand charges or other factors, locational differences in charges. But at the end of the day, all of those should be done based on the transmission energy downflow, because whether it's demand charges or something else, if you measure it at the customer meter, then you can only mitigate, say, demand charges behind the meter. And so you may cut out a lot of potential mitigation opportunities that could reduce the strain on the transmission system, but you get no economic benefit from it from your demand charge. So why would anybody ever do it, right? If you really want to use a demand charge to reduce the impact on the transmission system, then all of the activities that mitigate impact on the transmission system really ought to get the same credit. And the only way you do that is to use transmission energy downflow. So this proposal, it doesn't change the total revenue requirement at all. You know, what's built is what's built. It doesn't change the reporting process. It doesn't change operations. It doesn't necessarily change the formula that we're using, except for where we're measuring the energy. And, you know, if we want to change the formula, we could, based on transmission energy. So the first part is use TED, right? That Formula One, if you only look at the theoretical rate design considerations, it comes out ahead, just from a policy standpoint. However, if you can take it and close, you know, the last policy mile to the procuring department, you'll get arguably a bunch of savings, as well as having a more fair and equitable effort. Now, in California, now this is really California centric, we have a very odd system where the entities that are procuring energy are not necessarily the ones who are paying for the transmission. So we've got a situation where, for example, the non-participating transmission-owning municipal utilities, they already use transmission energy downflow, so they incorporate transmission charges into their procurement decisions. So they're already doing it right, you know, or in an unbiased way. When I say right, that's what I mean. Investor-owned utilities have a least cost best fit system that is overseen by the Energy Commission, or Utility Commission here, which is pretty transparent. And if this change were to be made, it would automatically propagate into procurement decisions under the least cost best fit methodologies, at least according to the people who know least cost best fit better than I do, that I have talked to. And if that's wrong, do let us know. But of course, in California, we have some nascent retail choice coming about through community choice aggregators. The way things are structured currently, community choice aggregators see no price signal, which means they have no incentive or really even any way to procure with transmission costs in mind. And to understand why that is, let's take a look at how TAC billing works in California. So we've got the three categories here. Cal CCA I'm putting in as the representative of the CCAs. Of course, PG&E, Southern California Edison, SDG&E are three investor-owned utilities. And then, of course, the Municipal Utility Association, I put their logo in to represent those guys. And all of these guys are going about procuring energy to serve their customers, right? Some of it's wholesale distributed generation, some of it's remote generation. Everybody has a mix of those. So far, so good. Then, based on that, that gets turned into, you know, that energy gets delivered to customers. So we've got our little subdivision down there. And then based on that, there is a bill for that transmission use that gets passed on back to 2 out of the 3 categories of load serving entities. So the municipal utilities, they get a bill for TAC, and they can look at it and say, oh, look, my procurement cost me to spend this much money. The IOUs, same deal. If their procurement influenced their TAC charges, they could look at their bill and say, oh, look, this is how much our transmission charges are based on what we've procured. The CCAs never get a TAC bill. It goes to their utility in whose territory they sit, and then the utility bills their customers directly. But the procuring entity never sees the signal. And this is really where the rubber meets the road, because the CCAs are the guys who are doing most of the procurement going forward. And I have friends at CCAs, and I'm going to ask your forgiveness, but I just couldn't resist, right? We've got the problem where we've got a bunch of teenagers out ordering dinner, and they're putting the tab on dad's credit card. Not to liken my CCA colleagues and friends to drunken teenagers, but it's kind of the same problem, because the CCAs are engaging in economic activity that causes costs to be incurred by third parties. There's a lack of a price signal that gets through, and that means that the procurement is only looking at a portion of the cost. And when you're only looking at the portion of the cost, it's a pretty good bet you get an economically distorted procurement. I think that's what ends up happening is CCAs don't see the bill. They don't care about it. They've got their hands filled with other things. They do their procurement. That drives up transmission costs for all ratepayers if they end up procuring more than an optimal amount of transmission connected resources. And that without a price signal, the CCAs are creating demand for transmission services, but they're not getting the bill for it. Somebody else is paying that bill. That's a problem. And I think we can think about, what are our next steps in California? How do we solve this, right? So one of the potential solutions is to build the CCAs for transmission access charges the way utilities are billed, the way munis are billed. There are reasons. This would involve, this would be a big shift for the CCAs, and this would be part of a longer discussion whether this is actually the option we'd want to do, but it is a solution that would work. It's on the table as a possibility. The second solution that has been kicked around, and this is stuff that Clean Coalition has certainly talked with a number of stakeholders about, didn't seem like this was the right idea at the first part, but I mentioned earlier that when CCAs procure energy, the bill for the transmission services actually goes to their host utility, right? So if you're in Marin County, Marin Clean Energy, who is my CCA, the transmission access charges that result from that procurement goes to PG&E, and then PG&E bills me, right? Theoretically, we could implement a system where PG&E has some extra funds that could be used to reimburse those entities that are procuring wholesale distributed generation based on the savings that they are generating from transmission charges. So if you have an LSE, CCA, an IOU, whoever, who's driving down transmission charges, by procuring local energy, then they get some compensation for that. This is another solution. It has some appealing aspects to it, which I'm happy to go into some other time, but it's a pretty complicated conversation. So the next steps, actually, I really want to bring everybody's attention to. We have a proposal. We are the sponsors of SB 692, authored by Senator Ben Allen. That's Ben's picture up there in the corner, from Malibu, very progressive, and smart guy. And right now we're working on a new concept, set of amendments. And so we're hoping to get both feedback and also to get a sense of whether this is the right approach from all of you who are listening in. And I'm hoping that some of you will have cleverer ideas than what I've come up with. And so I'm going to go a bit out on a limb, and that's me, a goat. You didn't know that I was a goat, but I am out on a limb, and basically float a trial balloon of a concept. Hasn't been approved. It's not final. So don't freak out if this is something you don't like, because it's still very provisional. It's just a concept. It's only a model. And it would be to have 4 parts. 1, have California actually have a recognition that distributed energy plays a key role in cost-effectively meeting climate goals and restraining the growth of transmission costs. Just a statement, a fact. The second is create a California state policy that procurement should include the cost of delivery. Again, shouldn't be that controversial, but when we get into brass tacks, it's going to be, because everything always is. The third part that we're looking at, and this is actually a suggestion that came from the California Independent System Operator, a little indirectly. I'm going to be talking with them next week to make sure that I've understood them correctly. But is to have, like, let's get the stakeholders together. Let's get the smart people in a room, figure out over the next year or so what the right solution here is that everybody can buy into. So that would be the CPUC, CAISO, the IOUs, the CCAs, get the process going, come up with a consensus solution. A little bit mirrors what CAISO has already done over the last year. And CAISO came to the conclusion like, this would be great. We could change to Formula One throughout the state. It wouldn't get through to procurement. That's not solving the entire problem. So insofar as that's accurate, fair point, let's solve the full problem, right? And then as a backstop, anytime you engage in a stakeholder coalition or process, it's not clear you're going to get a solution. So have a proposed solution that will come into place if no other solution arises. So give us your better ideas. I'm sure there are many out there. Support SB 692 as it goes forward through the Assembly and I guess back to the Senate. Talk to your local IOUs, CCAs, CAISO, CPUC, spur a solution. Let's get this solved. We have currently a whole host of organizations that have supported some form of the tax fix. Other versions, some of these partners have been less keen on. But these are some of the logos, most of the logos of some of these stakeholders who have participated. You'll notice folks from all sorts of sectors of California. So I am out on a limb. I have questions. I apologize for going a little longer than I had anticipated, but we certainly have time for a few questions.
We sure do. Thank you so much, Doug, for the wealth of information on our transmission access charges campaign and what's going on in the state. Really well done. And yeah, why don't we get to a few questions here. We can cover one or two. This one comes from Van Rainey and from the East Bay Clean Power Alliance. Van asks, can you share your perspective on the effort to regionalize the various ISO entities in the in the West into a multi-state network?
I was afraid somebody would ask that. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Have actually written on this a couple of times. I think the number one point is today, solving this issue, we are dealing with the California Independent System Operator, which is ultimately answerable to California elected officials who are a pretty notoriously liberal bunch. That has meant that this process has been much more collaborative and much more forward-moving than it otherwise certainly could have been. Dealing with other entities in other states, we certainly, many of the people on the call will understand that not every agency or system operator is equally open to change, particularly to support a new technology like wholesale distributed generation. So when it comes to regionalization, there's two elements of it that give us pause. One, of course, is changing the governance risks to move the board to an independent board that's no longer answerable to elected officials. Now we can discuss whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. There's certainly pluses and minuses. However, there's a certain significant political risk that would make getting rid of these distortions harder. We think that really fixing the TAC problem needs to be done first. Then as CAISO expands into other states, the transmission access charges, can sort of carry the gospel forward and make sure that the other transmission access charges don't spread a distortion that we have. If we have a known distortion in the system, it's a really good question whether we should be spreading it to other states. In addition to the the independent board issue. The other governance issue is, of course, there's efforts in the state of California to authorize this and to place constraints on transmission owners. This is AB 813, Chris Holden's bill. It has a lot of really good standards in it. A lot of good thought has gone into that bill. The issue is it's a tough nut to crack because we can set up standards for CAISO governance documents and for the governance documents of any other transmission operator that a transmission owner might join. The problem is we can't guarantee they're going to stay in place. And once we've got an independent board that has the authority to change those bylaws on its own volition, it's very difficult to predict what that's going to look like. And that's an additional political risk. We know, for example, as we move to say incorporate Utah, to put an example, just because we're likely to run into active efforts to interfere with the market rules like transmission access charges that may make renewable energy harder. This isn't necessarily affecting the renewable portfolio standards, but that's not the only part of this, right? We also need to have good market rules that give a level playing field for renewables. And we're in a situation and that take account of the social costs and carbon. And my understanding is that Utah has appropriated money to sue California to get rid of our standards, to make life safe for coal, and to ignore some of the costs of carbon. That gives me some pause. And then lastly, I think from a theoretical engineering standpoint, the notion of having a greater diversity of loads, a greater diversity of sources in order to deal with intermittency and volatility in renewable generation, there's a lot of merit there. I think the question we need to be asking is developing an RTO the best approach? It would work, but one of the other alternatives that we've really emphasized is a lot of the volatility can be done by starting at the distribution level, managing your distribution levels through dispatching load. To quote the CEO of Sonoma Clean Power, Jeff Cyphers, we need to move to a situation where we forecast generation, we dispatch load. So we can move load around at the distribution level, smooth out the intermittency, then that makes managing the transmission system a whole lot easier. And then we can see how much of an issue we are left with to determine how much we need to go reach for regional solutions. Because the regional solutions, they're going to involve a lot of spending on transmission. I know there are different analyses that have come to different conclusions, but I really have to think that we cannot bank on the notion that there's not going to be a significant amount of additional transmission spending. So what's the cheapest way to do it? What's the best way to do it? We've got several different approaches that have been suggested. Now we have to decide what is the best approach for meeting the real issues. They're genuine needs, genuine issues that are motivating that debate.
Great, thanks, Doug. We can do one more. So we are 2 minutes over. So I would ask that you keep the answer to this one brief, but this is a good one to end on. This comes from Daniel Seif from Seif Consulting, and Daniel's in Texas, and he asks, where does the policy push on this currently sit, and what the resistance claims as their rationale, and what are the next policy push steps?
Yeah, that's going to be hard to answer quickly. Yeah, shout out to our folks in Texas. My mom's family has been in South Texas for several centuries now at this point, so I feel a certain affinity there. The current status is we have gone through a process to reform just the high voltage transmission access charges through CAISO. CAISO has recognized in principle that the transmission energy downflow is preferable, but is unwilling to actually change the tariff until some of the attendant changes are also made. And if apologies to anybody from CAISO if I've gotten that mischaracterized, that's not my intention. The pushback has been actually multifold. Some of it has been looking at some of the factual questions. We've gotten a lot of, load's not going to grow. I think the California Energy Commission's put that one pretty well to bed for us. We've gotten discussions about, distributed generation doesn't really constrain the growth in transmission because there's all these other drivers, which is part of the reason I talked about that here today. We've also gotten some questions about fairness of like, well, embedded costs were done with a certain load in mind, and so we really can't change the way we charge for that now in midstream. I'm not sure that's a very good argument because it undercuts, it kind of ignores the fact that the beneficiaries do change over time, and it ignores the fact that our current system doesn't follow historical cost drivers either. So if we really believe that, we would not retain the current system that we have. Next steps are either to advance SB 692, or what may happen is the CPUC and CAISO and the stakeholders take a look at this and say, we really don't like the idea of a bill. Let's just do the stakeholder process, get this figured out without a bill. And hopefully we all get together and get this figured out. That would be lovely if that were to happen.
Great. Well, that's the perfect ending to this webinar today, and I thank you so much, Doug. So thanks to everyone else for sticking with us, and if you can just look at your screen, I have a screen share of the Clean Coalition website. You can catch Doug. Right now I'm in the upcoming events section of our website. You can catch Doug at the Grid Scale Storage Conference, along with our Executive Director, Craig Lewis. They're going to be presenting at the Hotel Whitcomb in San Francisco on June 6th. Also, we've got 3 more webinars in the very near future. The first one next Thursday on the rise of distribution resources planning. That's in partnership with E9 Insight, and our outreach director, John Bernhardt, will be presenting in that and our work in distribution resources planning, not just in California, but in other states as well. On May 24th, a week after that, we are going to be talking with Greg Thompson from the Clean Coalition about our North Bay Community Resilience Initiative. And then the next webinar in our series from the Peninsula Advanced Energy Community, also known as PAC, P-A-A-C, will be on June 5th. And Sam White from the Clean Coalition, he's the Economics and Policy Analysis Director. He will be talking about streamlining interconnection of advanced energy solutions to the grid. So sign up for all of those. And as I said in the beginning, we will be sending out the slides and a recording of this webinar within the next 2 business days. So we'll see everybody next time, and thanks for joining.
Yes, and you all have my email on the slide deck. So if you have questions or want to carry the conversation further, ideas of like obvious things I've missed, please let me know, because that's how we get good policy, is by having many people think about it. So thank you very much for coming.
Yes, thank you, Doug. And Doug's email is doug@clean-coalition.org. Have a great day, everyone.